Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to VOA.
Great to be here.
I'm sorry to see what is happening into your country, and we pray for the safety of your family and all the Ukrainians.
Thank you.
So let me begin by asking this question, since you've been with the Institute for Study of War for a couple of years, and you've deeply studied Russians' mindset and thinking. How did we get where we are here?
For sure. I think regaining control over Ukraine has been a very long-standing objective for Vladimir Putin. And for many years, he had tried to do so in many different ways, from trying to insert a puppet government, from military intervention in 2014, and over the past years, trying to manipulate both the West and Ukraine into trying to give up Ukraine's sovereignty voluntarily. And none of these efforts have really worked. So he resorted to a full-on military intervention. I think it's also really important to mention that this military invasion has nothing to do with protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Ukraine. In fact, they are the ones that suffer right now the most in the east and in the south. And this conflict has never been about ethnicity or language. Primarily, it's always been about the way of life.
And part of your family are from the East, yes?
Originally, yes.
Yeah, so they are speaking Russian, and they've been blending the two cultures. So but the question is, because some people, general audience might think that, okay, there is a separatist group in the eastern Ukraine, and then there is the western part. Is that the same, is that the right way of looking at Ukraine, or it's not like the separated country from west or east? How do you see that?
No, absolutely. I think it's not the right way to look at Ukraine at all. Couple of things. One, again, whether the Euromaidan revolution of 2014 or even the one in 2004, it always been about, again, the way of life. And I think Ukraine has moved away from Russia and from being an authoritarian state a long time ago. And Ukraine never wanted to be a police state like Russia is. So that has been a primary divide. I think the East versus West is one of the most successful Russian information campaigns around the world, and it's certainly not the core of this conflict. And finally, the so-called separatists in eastern Ukraine have never been that. It's a Russia-created, Russia-controlled entity, which is illegal Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic.
So we hear that there are rumors or some reports that Russia might go for using chemical weapons and those sort of things. What are you watching at this moment, and how do you see the prospect of war?
Look, I think the outcome of the war is not yet determined. Russia has failed, I think, its initial effort to capture Ukraine in a matter of days. And Ukraine is fighting relentlessly, of course. But now Russia is changing its approach and essentially shifted to bombing and leveling the cities, inflicting damage on civilians. Now we see terror campaign and kidnappings of local mayors. I do think there are other options in Russia's escalation ladder, and we are observing Russia setting information conditions for a potential chemical and biological incident. However, I don't think we're at this phase yet, but this is something we're certainly watching, in particular in the information space.
Yeah, so there is a graph that is a timeline that you had presented in your report back in 2018, I guess, or 2019. Do you want to add something to it, because the last couple of years probably there are some new developments, and when you look at this, do you see that your conclusion is being justified?
Yeah, I think, look, there are two core conclusions here. One is that Vladimir Putin's and Kremlin's intent overall when it comes to Ukraine and when it comes to the former Soviet states has been independent of the West. Their trajectory and the pace with which they pursued those objectives might have been accelerated and dampened in some cases. But Putin and also, honestly, his predecessor, Yeltsin, have tried to integrate elements of the former Soviet states, whether economically, militarily, or politically, into Russia-dominated structures. So I stand by that assessment, And we only see it being reinforced not only in Ukraine, but also in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, right, in Armenia, and in other countries.
So you are the first female CEO of Kyiv Post, if I'm right. 2014 and 2015, you were in charge of the Kyiv Post. You worked for that publication, and then you were the CEO of that publication in Kyiv. Let's change gear and go to the media world and ask you how effective you think the Russian misinfo, disinfo campaign have been so far.
A couple of points. First, look, I think Ukraine and also the West have advantage now in the information space, in part because it is a black and white war. Russia has attacked Ukraine unprovoked, and there was unity, a lot of unity in the information space. I am worried that over time, because the global attention span is short, there will be cracks, and any cracks in the information space are opportunities for the Kremlin. I think secondly, we've underestimated the hold that Vladimir Putin has on Russia's domestic information space. And we see right now that even when many Russians get the information about the true events transpiring, they simply do not believe it, because the narratives that the Kremlin has been spreading domestically were so solid, consistent, and for so long that the information blockade is not about means and mediums, it's about the ideas and principles and narratives. So I think that's another space we're watching closely, and I think it is actually quite essential for the West to first help Ukraine maintain information advantage, and two, still try to break informational blockade not only inside of Russia, but also inside of former Soviet states, which have a lot less, I think, information dominance from the Kremlin than Russia itself has.
How do you assess the migration of news media from Russia and banning on social media networks? Because it's very fascinating to see New York Times didn't leave Russia even during Stalin. Now they left the country. What is happening, you think? What is the driving factor that they're moving this organization out of Russia?
Well, I mean, I think it's Russia's targeting of civilians and media for years. I think it's basic physical safety. I think secondly, Russia is self-isolating, and that's not a new trend, right? That trend has been happening for the last many years. This is just the culmination of it all. I do think that there are different ways to break the information blockade and gain access to the information space inside of Russia. However, that would be a longer-term game.
So you think the reason was that law that had been passed that there severe punishment for even reporting on the truth?
I think it's targeting, Russia has a long history of targeting journalists, not only inside of Russia, but also in other countries that report on Russia, like in Ukraine.
Yeah, so how damaging has the so-called hacktivist data leaks been for Russia?
Yeah, I think in the short term, it's hard to assess. However, I think it is a definitely major vulnerability now in the long term, because all these data sets are out, and organizations with capabilities to collect and process them, I'm sure are certainly taking advantage of that. So I think it's actually a great way to gain insight about what otherwise has been a dark place inside of Russia informationally. So yes, I think it will have a significant impact over medium term.
So some people say that no matter what happens in Ukraine, Putin's intent is to move forward with the war. What are the challenges for Putin's, in your opinion, moving forward?
Look, first of all, Russia has yet again underestimated Ukraine and miscalculated on the ground. It's actually very interesting because if you recall, in 2014, the Kremlin has had a wrong assessment of Ukraine's local sentiment as well as the resistance it would face. And 8 years after, despite Ukraine overtly building up its defenses with the help of the West, the Kremlin made the same mistake yet again. And I think that's a problem that Kremlin cannot fix quickly. And another problem and challenge for Putin is actually mobilization. I think Putin took a major risk by deploying such a significant percentage of Russia's ground forces around and into Ukraine. And now I think he is facing a challenge with mobilizing not just inside of Russia, but also trying to engage Russia partner forces, whether it's Belarus, that Russia actually regained control over, or even Kazakhstan and other CSTO partners into the fight, because simply I think they do not want to be engaged in this war, and they will try to resist it to the extent they can. So I think it's going to be a major challenge for him. But at the strategic level, he has put a lot of things on the line here. It's not just Ukraine, it's also his regime. And it also is his project to reintegrate former Soviet states into Russia's orbit more closely. You know, everyone is now watching, and if he loses in Ukraine, he will lose, I think, significantly his influence in the former Soviet Union as well.
Last question. Ukraine has a lot of issues at this moment, and probably it's going to be more in the next few weeks or months if war is not stopped. If imagine that President Zelensky would ask for your opinion, what would you recommend to the President of Ukraine at this moment?
Look, I think my recommendation would be to him, but also to the West. The next few weeks are absolutely critical, and Ukraine still has advantage both in the information space, and Russia hasn't yet established either ground or air superiority, and Ukraine is fighting relentlessly. I do think that logistics will determine this war in large part, and the speed with which the supply chains get established from the West into Ukraine to both deliver humanitarian and military aid is critical. And I think the West should triple and quadruple its support, because this war will either be won in Ukraine or it will have to be fought elsewhere. So it's in West's interest to do everything to help Ukraine succeed. But I think secondly, doing everything possible to prevent Russia from establishing reliable supply chains of both human and military asset reinforcements as well as fuel is absolutely key as well.
Before I let you go, I'm sure you've heard that at least 2 American photojournalists have been killed. One was the Brent Renault that used to work for New York Times, and we heard about the cameraman of Fox News. Would like to say anything about this? Something is happening for journalists covering the war.
Yeah, look, I think first of all, condolences to their families, but most importantly, journalists are, I think, true heroes in this war, and I have a lot of former colleagues on the ground who are providing daily coverage of the conflicts despite constant risk to their lives. And I would wish that people outside of Ukraine would also support them constantly and more. And there are true heroes here, and also those in Russia who are continuing to do the coverage despite the risks they're also facing.
Thank you so much, Nataliya Bugayova. Thank you for taking the time.